Fighting games, a genre of competitive game renowned for its difficulty and ability to show individual skill. From technical inputs to insane reaction times, people love watching them due to how impressive it is to see others perform long combos and defend so well they seem like a computer. Although due to this perception, most people stray away from actually playing them because they seem too impossible. While still being difficult at the highest level, fighting games aren't nearly that hard at their core, and I'm gonna show you. This is an introduction to 2D fighting games. The HUD is arguably one of the most important parts of fighting games. Without it, nobody would be able to tell who's winning or what options they have available. There are four main elements of the HUD that are universal across the vast majority of 2D fighting games. There's the health bar, almost always at the very top of the screen on the left and right sides for players 1 and 2 respectively. If someone's health goes to 0, they lose. Simple enough. So obviously the objective of the game is to get your opponent's health to 0 without yours going there. Next is the timer, usually set directly between both players' health bars. If the timer hits 0, the person with more health left wins. Usually games end before the timer runs out, but there are certain scenarios where waiting out the clock is a legitimate strategy to win. One last note about the timer is that while it may show time in seconds, the actual ratio of real-world seconds to fighting game seconds may be slightly different per game. Most fighting games are best of 3 or first to 2 games where one person has to win 2 out of 3 rounds against their opponent to win the game. Most games have some kind of rounds 1 indicator near the timer and health bars that will show who's closest to winning the whole game instead of just the round. There are some games, or even the same games in different regions, that use a best of 5 or first to 3 system, which is the same thing but for 3 out of 5 rounds instead. The last HUD element that's common across the majority of 2D fighting games is the meter, which is called something different in every game that it's in, but always serves a similar purpose. The meter is usually at the very bottom of the screen on the left and right sides for both players. Meter is used to use various advanced techniques, either universal ones that every character in the game has access to, character-specific ones like enhanced normal or special moves, usually referred to as EX moves, or big cinematics moves called supers. Inputs are how you control your character. What button you press, and which direction you press, will give you different moves. As controlling your character is the name of the game, people have made a semi-universal system to talk about the directions and buttons in a more streamlined way called numpad notation, which is short for number pad notation as it's based off of the 10-key number pad used on most keyboards. Numpad notation turns every directional input into a number from 1 to 9, corresponding to the position of the number on a number pad, with 5 being neutral or not pressing a direction, 2 being down, 8 being up, 4 being back, and 6 being forward. Anytime you use number pad notation, it assumes you're talking from the player 1 side, or from the left facing right. So if 2, 3, 6 is a quarter circle forward motion on player 1 side, you would still say 2, 3, 6 on the player 2 side, even though it would be reversed and look like 2, 1, 4. To clarify, most fighting games base special inputs on which direction your character is facing, though some games base it around which side of the screen you're on. 2, 3, 6 is still 2, 3, 6 on player 2's side, not explicitly to the right. The numbers in numpad notation are only half of the system. The other half has to do with your attack buttons. Each game may have a different amount of attack buttons and may call them different things, but the generic rule is that in numpad notation you use the first letter of that attack button's name. So punch would be shortened to P and kick would be shortened to K. Some games you can't do just one letter, as they may have multiple strengths of punch or kick, so you would use 2 letters in that case to denote strength and then type. Light punch would be LP, and heavy kick would be HK. As a final example, the most common super input in Guilty Gear Strive is half circle back, then forward and end, which would be written as 6, 3, 2, 1, 4, 6, H. The player facing left would have to reverse the directional input regardless of player 1 or 2, but it would be written the same way regardless. There are also many different types of terms used across one or multiple fighting games that I won't be covering here, as that would take far too long and be too game specific. The neutral game is how every fighting game starts, and is where a lot of the game takes place. It's the time of the game where neither player has a distinct advantage and are trying to land a hit on their opponent. How every character and every game plays neutral is different, but there are some semi-universal things to consider. The basic game plan of most characters in neutral is going to be to try staying outside of your opponent's range while still being able to hit them. This is called spacing. If you have more range than your opponent, this is possible, but if you have less than range than your opponent, you won't be able to. But there is still stuff you can do. Most of the time, if your opponent attacks, they'll extend a portion of their body towards you at the same time, allowing you to hit them if they miss you. This is called whiff punishing. Whiff punishing is the main way to hit someone with longer range than you, but the best thing to do is to get close to them, as if they have a lot of range, they're usually far slower because of it, and vice versa for short range. Getting close to your opponent mainly requires good movement and prediction of where your opponent will try attacking so you can avoid it and get closer. Another thing you can try to do in neutral, as any character, is to push your opponent toward the corner of the stage. Most 2D fighting games have a finite stage size, and when you reach one edge of the stage, it has what is effectively a wall at the end, called the corner. If you or your opponent are near or in the corner, they have much less space to move, so it will be far more difficult to avoid their opponent, giving the person outside of the corner a distinct advantage, as they'll have an easier time landing hits on their opponent and or forcing them to defend. Jumping is almost always going to be a risky option, as most characters have a restricted set of things they can do once they leave the ground. While jumping is very risky, it can lead to massive rewards. You may be somewhere your opponent isn't expecting, leading you to either be able to land a hit, or get close to your opponent while they're forced to defend. Some of the main uses of jumping in neutral is to avoid long-range projectiles, usually while closing the distance between you and your opponent, or to predict when your opponent will use a slow move that covers the ground in front of them and jump over it so you can attack them while they're still recovering. There are two main ways to counter your opponent jumping: anti-airing or air-to-airing. Anti-airing is when you use a grounded move that covers the air above and or in front of you to hit someone that's jumping there and try to scare them away from jumping again. Air-to-airing is when you jump yourself to intercept the opponent before they reach you from the air, attacking them sooner than they would have normally expected you to. Arguably, one of, if not the most important skills in fighting games is defense. It allows you to avoid taking damage and can allow you to find an opening to attack your opponent instead of you being attacked. There are two universal types of blocking in 2D fighting games: stand blocking and crouch blocking. Stand blocking is done by holding 4 or just walking backwards, and crouch blocking is done by holding 1 or down back, not directly down. Reversed for facing left. There are roughly 5 different things that you have to watch out for on defense: high attacks or overheads, middle or mid attacks, low attacks, throws, and cross-ups. High attacks can only be blocked while standing, low attacks can only be blocked while crouching, and mid attacks can be blocked either way. Throws can hit you if you're blocking or just standing on the ground at all, and cross-ups are when your opponent attacks you from the opposite side from where they were initially, forcing you to switch from blocking on one side to blocking on the other side. The most basic way you should be trying to block is to default to crouch blocking and try to react to overheads and switch your block on reaction. The reason for this is that lows are some of the fastest moves in fighting games. They're not meant to be reactable, whereas high attacks either require your opponent to be jumping or are slower grounded attacks with a noticeable wind-up that is reactable if you're looking for it. When you're at a disadvantage and are forced to play defense, you should be patient and look for openings in your opponent's attacks where you can either try to hit them with a fast move or move away and reset to the neutral game to try to hit them again from there. Most of the time, Openings are either when your opponent is using a slow-to-hit move or are trying to close the distance to keep attacking, as every hit attack you block will push your opponent slightly farther away, making being patient and just sitting there blocking a viable strategy if your opponent is trying to be as safe as possible while attacking. You may even be able to block for long enough that your opponent is pushed so far away they whiff an attack and you can whiff punish them. Playing the neutral game is one way to win the game, but that will mainly be small single hits adding up over time. Another way to win that's far more efficient for most characters is to get close to their opponent, as that's where they're the strongest when attacking. In the majority of 2D fighting games, you have the most ability to combo and deal damage to your opponent by hitting them from close range. How each character ends up getting close to their opponent varies. Obviously, it's unlikely that you'll end up actually landing a clean hit even when you get that close, so that's where mix-ups and block strings come in. A mix-up is when you use a variety of moves that you have to defend against in different ways to hit your opponent. You usually set up a mix-up in a block string, and a block string is a series of attacks you make against a defending opponent. There are three main types of mix-ups in 2D fighting games: high, low, hit, throw, and cross-ups. High-low mix-ups are where you have a choice on offense to attack with an overhead or a low move which needs to be quickly reacted to, and blocked standing and crouching respectively. Hit-throw is where you choose between attacking or trying to throw your opponent. The person on defense needs to guess correctly and either block the attack or jump away from the throw. In certain scenarios, your opponent may be able to attack you for trying to throw them. Cross-ups, as described earlier, make your opponent guess between blocking left or blocking right. The person on defense usually needs to either guess which side they block, or know the exact range and movements of their opponent's attacks to see which side it'll hit on. One last thing relating to mix-ups is 50-50s. They're a mix-up, usually high-low, that end up hitting at the exact same time for either choice, so the defender quite literally has to guess which one it'll be. Some people also use the term for incredibly fast mix-ups as well, though there are usually techniques on defense that allow you to have an easier time blocking them in that case, but even those are difficult, and it's still very likely that they'll get hit. When you attack your opponent and they actually end up blocking, you'll get pushed back a little bit away from them. This limits the options you have, and while you may still be in range to hit your opponent, what move you land in will either give you an advantage by either making you able to move before your opponent, or be able to be animation cancelled into another one of their attacks by gatlings, special cancels, or super cancels. Or it will make you move after your opponent so that you can no longer safely attack, or it may even leave you wide open to an attack yourself. Gatlings are normal attack to normal attack cancels. Special cancels are usually canceling normal attacks into special input moves, and super cancels are canceling something into a cinematic super attack, usually normals, though some games allow specials or even other supers. I'm not saying fighting games are easy, far from it, but they're not actually that difficult to pick up if you know what to do. Because while combos are cool, deal a lot of damage, and look really nice, you won't be able to actually land them if you don't know the basics.
Slap!